Let me tell you a quick story about one of the craziest domestic cases I have ever worked on. But first, really quick, go down in the comments below and let me know what the craziest domestic case is that you have ever worked on as a private investigator. The client for this case was a well-respected businessman who had built a successful business over 25 years. Now he was approaching retirement age and he was looking to sell his business. Then suddenly, out of the clear blue, he started getting messages and phone calls from someone from his past. This woman he knew many years ago was essentially stalking him and saying she was his wife. She was literally telling people all over town that they were back together and they had been married for the past 12 years. Then he started getting mail for her with his last name at his house. And this wasn't just junk mail, folks. It was things like credit card statements and bills. The client finally confronted her with this, and she simply told him that she would be happy to discuss it all at home where she and the kids were planning on moving back to. And this isn't even the craziest part of the story. Now, they didn't have any kids together, but she had several from a previous marriage that went way back before they had ever originally met. The client started to do some snooping around and discovered that she very well may be under treatment for mental health issues, and he learned she may have been involved with the sales of illegal drugs and other felonious behavior. After a couple of months of these stalking activities, including her going to his house, sitting in her car in the driveway for hours, taking care of the flowers, doing some lawn care and other outside activities as if she lived there, the client finally sought legal assistance and hired an attorney. The first thing the attorney did was file for a TRO, or a temporary restraining order, against her and called me in to assist with an investigation. The primary objectives of the case were, number one, to protect the client's assets, to include hundreds of thousands of dollars, including his business, real estate, and other physical and cash assets. Number two, prove the allegations of stalking were founded, as she was still stalking him on an almost daily basis. Number three, provide evidence showing what, if any, level of the contribution she ever had in the household. So the first thing I did was I interviewed the client himself to get the facts straight from him, as well interview his now current wife. Now get this, his current wife and the woman who alleged she was his wife were old friends. In fact, they were close friends 12 years prior when she, the other woman, alleges the client and her got married. In these initial interviews, I also discovered that she, the crazy lady, was waiting for him most days along a certain road he drove as he went to work. As he would approach, she was sitting there in her vehicle. She would wave, she would blow kisses and honk at him and then follow him all the way to work. This intel was golden, folks. I was able to establish counter surveillance and obtain very good evidence of her essentially violating the TRO. So once we had a couple of days of that behavior, the attorney was able to have her arrested on a violation of the restraining order. Of course, she was able to bail out quickly, but now she knew he had private investigators working for him. So she stopped most of that activity. The key word there is most. I know this sounds crazy, but it gets crazier. Just hang on. Next, we interviewed all of the client's neighbors, and all but one of them had lived in their current residence 12 years prior, and they remembered the crazy lady. In fact, they all stated that he, the client, often had barbecues and other neighborhood-type events and invited them over. Further details from these interviews led me to believe that while she and her kids lived there for a period of time, it was more off and on and never for longer than a week or two, and she was usually gone for many weeks, and this occurred over maybe about a 6 to 12 month time frame. I also discovered that none of the neighbors were ever told by him or her that they were married. In fact, she often talked about how nice it was for him to let her and her kids live in the basement. The neighbors also never observed her taking part in household chores, such as cleaning the house, cleaning up after events, or doing yard work, nothing, and they never observed any moments of intimacy in public between them. Now, there were many facets to this investigation, and I had multiple private investigators working in differing roles as it progressed. The entire investigation took almost a year before the case went to trial. We had 24-hour surveillance conducted on her residence to see who was coming and who was going, and whom she had relations with, and this surveillance indicated several interesting facts. First, there indeed was a high probability of drug activity at her house. As well, she had a male living with her, and get this, it appeared they had an intimate relationship. Surveillance also indicated she would randomly leave her house and get suspiciously close to the client's house. not quite within the boundaries of the TRO, where she could watch his house at a distance. The attorney also requested that we look into her financial background, and this uncovered several interesting things. One was that her house was under foreclosure and she was essentially refusing to leave. We were also able to determine that she did have a good paying job, but that it might be in jeopardy due to her missing a lot of work because of her rather erratic behaviors. And we learned she had several lines of credit which she had taken out using his last name, and she had some bank accounts using his last name with large overdrafts. I am talking credit lines in the tens of thousands of dollars, and they had all been maxed out. She originally had the bills going to his house, but then later switched them to a P.O. box. When we researched the P.O. box, we found out she had set it up in his and his business's names. Now, shortly after this all started with the stalking, and after the TRO, she got an attorney and she filed for divorce. Yep, divorce, after what she called 12 years of blissful marriage. She stated she found out he was being unfaithful. In fact, he had even married another woman, and their kids were devastated due to the fact that her kids had lived with him for so many years and looked up to him as a father. They were, in essence, his children too. Now, she was being reasonable. Well, in her own mind. She was just asking for possession of the house, one of the vehicles he owned, $3,000 a month in child support, spousal maintenance, and only half ownership of the business. She didn't want control of the business, just half the ownership, which would entitle her to half of the sale price when he sells the business. Next, we had to attack the marriage allegation. According to her statements, they got married at one of those Las Vegas-style wedding events, just her and him, and the minister and his wife. My client's recollection of it all was a little fuzzy. He did remember they went through some sort of ritual or something, but he thought it was a joke. He had also admitted they had been partying for a couple of days in Vegas, if you know what I mean. Now, there was a marriage certificate, which she had possession of. However, there was no record of it having ever been filed with any county that I could find. When I talked to the pastor and his wife, they did think it was the pastor's signature on the certificate too, but they kept no formal records of these events, as they did so many of them, some in seriousness and some just for fun. When court time rolled around, one of the things we tried to do was get the kids on the stand. She, of course, refused to allow that. We did get the pastor on the stand that supposedly married them. We also had all of the client's immediate neighbors on the witness list as friendly witnesses, and we had many subjects that we had seen arrive at her house multiple times who were questioned as to how long she resided at the house and if they ever knew of her living at our client's house, which the answer from all was no. And her live-in boyfriend was subpoenaed, but he was a no-show. I really felt bad for her attorney. He had little to go on except a faded marriage certificate, which was never filed into any court records. A couple of friends of hers that could only testify to her saying she was married, but their recollection of how long contradicted each other. And of course, her own testimony. The trial lasted a full day. Then the judge said he needed some time to go over everything and set a final hearing for 1 week out. Folks, this was a nerve-wracking week for all involved. When we finally got the final hearing, the judge's findings were very positive for our client and almost humorous. His findings were they were married for 1 month 12 years ago, since they had a 30-day period to file that marriage certificate and no one ever filed it. And the children were not his, nor never were his responsibility. She was awarded 1 month of maintenance based on what maintenance would have been 12 years prior. So she got a whopping $300. The house and business and all the other assets of our clients were his and his only. And her assets and debts were hers and hers only. What it all boiled down to was she thought she could scare our client into a settlement of some kind. She had a ton of debt and no way to get out of it. And come to find out later, she did have drug addiction problems and mental health issues, which compounded the situation. Now, that is just a little bit of what is involved in one of my investigations. If you want to know more about what PIs do today, then check out this video.